Thank you for watching this video in the series Farm Management During Uncertain Times. Today we have with us Dr. Charlie Martinez, Assistant Professor and Extension Economist with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Director of the UT Center of Farm Management, and Dr. Aaron Smith, Associate Professor and Extension Economist with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Co-Director of the UT Center for Farm Management. And today we'll be talking about the impacts of rising interest rates. So Dr. Smith, if you want to kind of just start off with a brief overview of what exactly is going on with interest rates and inflation.
Sure. Just to kind of give a quick summary, I'm sure many people that follow the news and what's going on with the general economy are aware of this, but just to kind of give an overview of where we're at. This is as of August 2nd. And so the latest inflation number is 9.1%. And you can see where we're at relative to past years. We haven't seen inflation at this level since about 40 years ago. And so in order to combat inflation, one of the primary tools that the U.S. Federal Reserve will end up using to try to bring inflation down is increasing interest rates. And so as you can see in the blue line on the graph that's shown here, we've seen interest rates, this is the bank prime lending rate, move from 3.25% at the start of the year to where we're at 5.5% right now, with an expectation for additional interest rate hikes in the third and potentially fourth quarters of 2023 to try to end up bringing down the inflationary pressures we've ended up seeing.
Yeah, and obviously with higher interest rate, it means it costs more to borrow money, but sometimes you still need to make capital purchases for the farm. So what would your recommendation be, Dr. Smith, if someone needs to buy something right now?
Well, one of the first things that I always tell people is make sure that you get with your lender and discuss a plan moving forward. The first thing is to map out what your anticipated capital expenditures are going to be. Make sure that you arrange operating credit for the next production year, and then obviously have contingency plans in place to make sure that if there is unforeseen requirements, whether it's a capital purchase or whether it's additional operating money, to end up having a path to end up accessing those resources. And then the other one is to just make sure that you're evaluating all the options that are present for your operation. Hopefully most people or most farms have taken advantage of the low interest rates we've seen prior to 2022 and have their debt, particularly their term debt, structured so that we've got a lot of fixed rates, and hopefully we've been able to take advantage of some of those previous cheaper interest rates, because obviously now, while we might still be able to get some good financing terms and conditions relative to where we might be in the next 6 months, we have seen a tremendous increase in that. So making sure that your debt's structured appropriately and making sure that you're in constant communication with your principal ag lender, I think, is the big thing. This is when some of these relationships that you've built with lenders can really pay dividends when we do have times like this where planning is so essential. And getting in front of that lender early is going to be imperative, particularly for arranging 2023 financing, because we are still seeing elevated input costs. And it's going to be expensive to potentially produce the crops in 2023.
Anything to add to that, Dr. Martinez?
No, I think, I think he did a really good job of explaining it. I would like to sprinkle a little bit, though, in terms of addressing the needs for operating credit a little bit. I think it kind of goes, hand in hand with each other, of understanding your debt structure and your term debt, as Dr. Aaron Smith said, but also look at your cost structure in itself and start thinking about, if you do need more operating credit or capital, essentially cash flow in the short term, are there things that you could get rid of or take off and find some salvage value to help with the needs and maybe the constraint of needing that cash flow? From that perspective, I think if you're going to go talk to the lender, you also got to have an idea in terms of how to have an intelligent conversation with them, saying, hey, I've got rid of a lot of stuff that I don't need, and I'm trying to be as efficient with my resources as I can. And I think that's where it goes, they tie together a little bit hand in hand when it comes to operating capital and understanding what you have and what you don't have and what you're going to need here in the short term. And I say short term relative, within the next calendar year. And of course, everyone's going to be a little bit different, depends on your operation and what you're doing in terms of ag production. But, for instance, if you have row crops versus livestock and when you're going to need that capital and when the turnover happens. And so I think, Dr. Smith did a good job of highlighting the fact that you need to know where you are. And then within that, understanding how much more money you need if you need it. Maybe you realize, hey, if I get rid of this and get some salvage value, I might not need as much as I think, especially given the fact that we're looking at higher interest rates. If you can borrow less of the higher cost, then that's even a win in itself.
Yeah, and I'll add on that, preparation for an appointment with the lender is always greatly appreciated. If you do end up having all your documents in order and kind of a plan to move forward, it's way better to end up coming in prepared with the documents that can reflect your needs for the next 6 months or year out, because that'll allow you to have some productive use of the lender's expertise and be cognizant of both your time and the lender's time as well.
Dr. Martinez, you touched briefly on, the idea if you need more operating capital that you can, look if is there anything that's maybe unnecessary to the operation, which can kind of fund your operating for the short term. But whenever we look at the liquidity and have an asset around to support the farm, what is just the real importance of maintaining that relatively high liquidity?
Well, of course, we always got to remember cash is king, right? And having that on hand is always going to be important. We've talked about, get rid of stuff that you don't need and kind of highlighted a little bit or talked about a little bit, but be as efficient with your capital from the get-go as you can be, right? If you're used to buying a little bit more out in the front end, say you're buying feed, in bulk, try to capture the discount, you might not be able to go do that. But that doesn't mean that you can't try to find a way to be as efficient with that capital, whether it be watching when fertilizer prices, if they were to tank a little bit, you want to have that ability to go out and purchase lower inputs, right? Dr. Smith could probably highlight a bit more when it comes to the row crop side and the input side, but I think having capital on hand and liquidity on hand is very important. But what's to say that we don't find some positivity in a certain market that if you have the capital, you could actually capitalize on it. And I think that's going to be one of the keys to people making it through this rough time.
Yeah, one of the big ones that is important, again, this goes back to the planning side of things, is understanding what your current liabilities look like. And making sure that you have sufficient available capital to fund the input purchases. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen as a result of some of the inflationary pressures and the supply chain disruptions that we've seen in 2022 is timing. When you purchase some of these inputs, has been a tremendous asset for some people and has really penalized others. And there's not a crystal ball to say when the timing is 100% right. Each individual operation has to make that decision based on the inputs that they need and the current market offerings, but making sure that you have the available operating credit or cash resources to purchase something like fertilizer when you do see a good deal can really be a huge benefit when we're looking at having that in place prior to having to make that decision. It's something where you can really get some potential savings by having those arrangements already in place.
And speaking of liquidity and credit, Dr. Smith, whenever I don't have cash on hand, something that can make me feel really liquid would be a credit card. Could you speak a little bit about proper use and improper use of those?
Yeah, credit cards are one of those ones where that's usually an early warning sign if you're not paying those on a monthly basis. Credit cards are very high interest rates. Most of them can be variable interest rates, so they will increase as the prime lending rate increases as well. But when you look at the average credit card, I believe the average percentage is in between 17 and 18% interest on an annual basis, in addition to any of the other fees that you might end up being paying on that. And so, try to avoid using credit cards where you're not paying them off on a monthly basis and avoiding those interest payments. It's one where you can really get yourself into a lot of problems in terms of liquidity if you're using credit cards to fund longer term purchases, or purchases that won't be paid off within the month. And so, that's one that I think people should really be cognizant of. I'm a huge proponent of having a credit card that is designated for farm expenses. I think that helps with bookkeeping, but we have to use these credit instruments appropriately. And a credit card, if you are not paying it off each month, I would strongly consider getting rid of it, because it's something where it's going to cost you a substantial amount of money in the long term. So that's one that is always, you always have to be careful with. If you aren't paying your credit card, I think you need to get with a lender and find out, what's the root cause of not being able to pay that off, and then develop a plan moving forward where you have access to maybe revolving credit that isn't attached to a credit card with extremely high interest rates.
Reading the fine print is very key when you start using the credit cards. And I think that's a good point, that Ty, when you say, credit card can make you feel real liquid real quick. But understanding what you're getting into is key. And I've heard Dr. Smith talk about that talk, or have that talk with producers many a times, and read the fine print's always the take home for sure.
Yeah. And then just to kind of wrap things up, what we talked about, some of the debt structure, and a little bit about interest rates. So how do we make sure that the debt that we currently have and that we're planning on getting is structured properly? And then a little bit about, should I be looking at a variable interest rate right now, or do I need to be focused on fixed?
Yeah, it's one of those ones where the expectation is for interest rates to continue to increase for the rest of this year. And so again, right now I'd be looking more towards a fixed interest rate, if possible. Obviously, you still have to look at what the offerings are from the lender that you're choosing between both fixed and variable, and weigh the risks. But one of the ones that I think does make some sense is to put a fixed interest rate, but have the flexibility to make additional payments, pay it off early, or renegotiate the terms and conditions down the road. So it is looking at what the interest rate values between fixed and variable credit is, but also in these types of circumstances, it's nice to be able to maintain options to end up revisiting this in the next year, or the next 2 years, where we might see a completely different interest rate environment. When you look at where we're at right now in terms of battling inflationary pressures, the interest rates are likely going to continue up until we end up seeing inflation come down. But after inflation ends up getting back down to a more targeted level from the U.S. Federal Reserve, somewhere in that 2 to 3% range, I would suspect that interest rates will probably come down reasonably quickly. And so again, maintaining that long-term flexibility while protecting yourself short term against variable rate interest rate hikes, I think is something that really needs to be considered and investigated for all producers.
Right. No, we hear about variable rates and fixed rates, and when do they have advantages and when they don't have disadvantage, or when they have advantages and disadvantages. And oftentimes people are saying, the advantage of a variable rate is whenever we anticipate it start to come down, right? And with the expectation that we do see it to continue to increase, I think that, locking it in the interest rate now and having the ability to come back later on to try to adjust, I think would be the smart play. I would put the variable, trying to get to a variable interest rate right now, I'd put that on the bottom of the playlist when it comes to how we're going to work through this. If you're thinking about sports and you're making a play call, locking in a variable interest rate is probably not the smart call right now.
The other one that I will add on to that too is when you are looking at different credit offerings, I'm a big fan of seeing what else is out there on the market. There might be some input suppliers that might have some very beneficial arrangements. The one thing that I always say when I give my cost of borrowing talk is, you can come to an answer when you have these numbers. If you know how much you need and what the terms and conditions are, you can determine which one is the one that's going to be the more financially beneficial for your operation. It's just a question of doing your due diligence and putting pen to paper, so to speak, to get an estimate of what that cost is going to be, both in the short term and the long term. So, fully investigating what credit arrangements are available out there, I think is a wise move as well. But one big thing I would say for the 2023 year in particular is make sure that the operating requirements are you secure credit for your operating requirements earlier than normal, just to make sure that you have a bunch of options on the table.
Agreed.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I know it's a really rough time out there right now for farmers, and so it's really important to make sure that the money that you are borrowing, you really have it structured properly, and you try to avoid it obviously where you can, but it's definitely an important part of farming. Other things obviously to think about will be family living expenses, what's going on with inflation. How do I stay in business this year, kind of hair on fire emergency things to make sure that I'm still farming next year. And you can see some of those other videos to find out more information about that. And if you go to farmmanagement.tennessee.edu, you can see a lot more information about economics, and find a specialist in your area to actually sit down and work with you on your farming operation. But in the meantime, thank you for tuning in to this video for farming during uncertain times, and have a good day.